The lights died first. 1 second, Linda Hart was standing in the private archive room of Hudson Cole's Aspen Chalet, flipping through a folder marked Classified, Do Not Duplicate. The next, the entire estate went black, and somewhere deep in the walls, she heard the low groan of the backup generators failing to kick in. That wasn't supposed to happen. Nothing in this house was supposed to fail. Ever. Her fingers froze on the folder. 3 years working as Hudson Cole's executive secretary had taught her exactly one unbreakable rule. If the power in this house ever went out on its own, it meant someone wanted it that way. She heard boots on gravel outside. Not one pair, many. Linda's heart slammed against her ribs as she eased toward the window, careful to stay low. Through the glass, in the wash of a single security floodlight that hadn't yet been cut, she counted 6 men moving in formation across the snow. Rifles, night vision, tactical vests. This wasn't a robbery. This was an operation. And at the front of it, walking like he already owned the place, was a man in a long black coat she recognized instantly, even though she'd only seen his face once, in a photograph Hudson kept locked in his private safe. Victor. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know why Hudson flinched every time it came up in conversation, or why he'd once told her, half joking, half deadly serious, "If you ever see that man's face in real life, you run, and you don't stop running." She should have run. Instead, her legs betrayed her, rooting her to the spot as the front door downstairs exploded inward. "Search every room," Victor's voice rang out, calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who had done this before and enjoyed it. "He's not here, but I know someone who matters to him is." Linda's stomach dropped. Me. He means me. She wasn't important. She was a secretary. She answered calls, managed calendars, kept Hudson's coffee exactly the way he liked it. Bitter, no sugar, 1 ice cube. Why would armed mercenaries be hunting for her? There was no time to make sense of it. Footsteps were already pounding up the staircase. She bolted, silent on the thick carpet, toward the one place in this house she actually knew, the corridor near the biometric vault, where a narrow airlock chamber sat tucked behind a false panel, built for Hudson's own emergency use. She'd only seen it once, months ago, when he'd shown her, in case you're ever here alone and something goes wrong. At the time, she'd laughed it off as paranoia. She wasn't laughing now. The panel slid shut behind her just as she heard boots stop right outside it. Through a hairline gap in the seam, she saw Victor pause in the hallway, tilting his head like a predator scenting the air. "Linda," he said, almost gently, almost fond. "I know you're close. Hudson's little secretary. Funny thing, a man like him, cold as ice to everyone else, and yet he'd burn this whole city down for you. Makes a person wonder why." She pressed a trembling hand over her own mouth to keep from making a sound. Victor waited another 10 seconds, then turned and barked an order to his men to keep searching. His footsteps faded down the hall. Only then did Linda allow herself to move, fumbling in the dark for the emergency phone Hudson had wired directly into the panel, untraceable, encrypted, connected to exactly one number. His. It rang once. Twice. On the third ring, he picked up, his voice sharp with the particular alertness of a man who never really slept. "Linda, it's late. Is everything—" "Boss," she whispered, and her voice cracked in a way she hated, in a way she never let herself sound in front of him. "Boss, please, come and get me. They're here. Victor is here." Silence on the line. A silence so total, so charged, that for a moment she thought the call had dropped. Then Hudson Cole's voice came back, and it wasn't the voice of the composed, unreadable executive she worked for every day. It was low, and it was lethal, and underneath it, buried so deep she almost missed it, was something that sounded terrifyingly close to fear. "Where exactly are you hiding?" "The vault airlock. Boss, I don't understand why they want me. I'm nobody. I'm just— Don't move, he cut her off, and she heard the unmistakable sound of him already moving fast, a door slamming, keys jangling, an engine somewhere roaring to life. Don't you dare open that panel for anyone but me. Do you hear me, Linda? Anyone. How long? She breathed. However long it takes, he said. And for the first time in 3 years of working for him, Linda Hart heard Hudson Cole's voice shake. I am not losing you again. The line went dead before the strange, impossible weight of that last word could fully land on her. Again. Outside the panel, footsteps returned, closer this time. Linda pressed herself into the freezing dark of the airlock, one hand clutched over her pounding heart, and waited, praying the man racing toward her through a blizzard would get there before Victor's men found the seam in the wall. 40 minutes earlier, Hudson Cole had been sitting at the head of a table in a private room above the city, staring down 6 of the most dangerous men on the continent. The cartel summit had taken 3 months to arrange. Old rivals, older grudges, all of them finally willing to sit in the same room because Hudson Cole's name carried enough weight to make enemies behave, at least for one night. Every second of it had been calculated, every word chosen. It was the kind of meeting that could end wars or start them. He didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember what he said to the room full of men who did not appreciate being abandoned mid-negotiation. He remembered only Linda's voice, thin and terrified in a way he had never once heard it in 3 years, and the word Victor landing in his chest like a bullet. By the time reason caught up to him, he was already in the elevator, already dialing his pilot, already moving faster than a man his size and reputation had any right to move. Ground the summit. Tell them I'll reschedule or I won't. I don't care. He snapped at his second-in-command, Marcus, who was jogging to keep pace with him through the parking garage. Get the chopper fueled, now. Boss, that meeting was everything. Delgado's people flew in from 3 countries. Linda is in danger. Hudson didn't slow down. That's the only sentence that matters right now. Marcus, who had worked for Hudson Cole for 11 years and had never once seen him raise his voice over anything short of a direct threat to the syndicate itself, went quiet. He'd long suspected there was something about the boss's secretary that didn't add up. The way Hudson's whole posture changed when she walked into a room, the way he remembered her coffee order down to the ice cube, but forgot the names of men who'd worked for him for a decade. Marcus had chalked it up to normal boss-favorite-employee dynamics. He was starting to think he'd been wrong. The storm hit the moment the helicopter cleared the city skyline. Snow slammed the windshield in sideways sheets, visibility dropping to almost nothing, wind gusts strong enough to make the whole aircraft shudder and drop. Any sane pilot would have turned back. Hudson's pilot, a grizzled ex-military flyer named Sato, who'd flown him through worse, gave him one look and one question. You sure about this? Fly, Hudson said. It wasn't a request. They came in low over the mountain, running dark, no lights, using nothing but Sato's instrument panel and years of muscle memory to find the chalet's private landing pad through a wall of white. Below them, Hudson could see flashlight beams sweeping the estate grounds. Victor's men, moving in a search pattern he recognized instantly. Military-trained, efficient, merciless. The moment the skids touched snow, Hudson was already out the door, a rifle in his hands he'd pulled from the aircraft's hidden compartment, moving into gunfire before the blades had even stopped spinning. This was not the Hudson Cole his employees knew. The tailored suits, the careful diplomacy, the cold, unreadable calm, all of it fell away in an instant, replaced by something older and far more dangerous. A man who had built his empire not behind a desk, but in exactly this kind of storm, years before he'd learned to hide it. The first 2 men went down before they registered he was there. He knew this property better than anyone alive. Every blind corner, every angle of cover, every place a man could hide, and every place he couldn't. He used all of it, cutting through the tree line, drawing fire away from the house, forcing Victor's team to scatter and regroup. "He's here!" someone shouted, too late. Hudson put him down and kept moving. Inside, he found the front hall in chaos, furniture overturned, a firefight already underway between two of Victor's men and what remained of his own skeleton household staff. He ended it in seconds, brutal and precise, and didn't break stride. The vault airlock. She said the vault airlock. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his lungs burning, his mind running a single loop. Don't be too late. Don't be too late. Not again. I can't lose her again. A thought so old and so raw, he didn't let himself examine it. Not now. Not with Victor's men still in the building. He found the corridor, found the false panel, exactly where he'd shown her, back when it had felt like an absurd precaution, a boss being overly protective of an employee for reasons he'd never let himself name out loud. "Linda!" He kept his voice low, urgent, pressed against the panel. "It's me. Open it." Nothing. "Linda, it's Hudson. You're safe. Open the door." A long, agonizing second passed. Then the panel slid back, and there she was, pale, shaking, her cardigan torn at the shoulder, mascara streaked down one cheek, but alive, whole, alive. And something in Hudson's chest that had been clenched tight for the entire flight, finally, violently, released. He didn't think. He pulled her out and into his arms before either of them could stop it, holding her the way a man holds something he genuinely believed he might never touch again. "I've got you," he said into her hair, his voice rough. "I've got you. I'm here. You're safe." Behind them, down the hallway, Victor's voice rang out one last time, closer than either of them wanted. "Cole! I know you're in there!" Before the sound of retreating boots and a distant explosion signaled his men pulling back, their numbers too thinned to finish the job tonight. Linda pulled back just far enough to look up at him, still trembling, confusion cutting through her fear. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does he want me, Hudson? I'm your secretary. I file your paperwork. I'm nobody to men like him." Hudson looked down at her, at the face he'd once known better than his own, and felt 6 years of careful, deliberate silence crack straight down the middle. "You're not nobody," he said quietly, cupping her face in both hands like she was something impossibly fragile. "You have never been nobody, Linda. Not to me. Not to anyone who ever really knew you." She didn't understand what he meant, not yet. But outside, the storm was already clearing, and somewhere in Geneva, a truth 6 years buried was about to claw its way into the light. Geneva greeted them with a cold, clean dawn, the kind of pale winter light that made everything look scrubbed and unreal. The private clinic sat tucked into the hills above the lake, unmarked, unlisted, the sort of place that existed for people who could not afford to be found in an ordinary hospital. Hudson had used it twice before, once for a bullet wound he'd never explained to anyone, and once, years ago, for something he still refused to talk about at all. Linda didn't know that second time had been for her. She sat now on the edge of a hospital bed in a private suite that looked more like a 5-star hotel room than a medical facility, wrapped in a thick robe, a mug of something warm and herbal going cold in her hands. The doctor had already come and gone. Mild hypothermia, a few bruises, shock, nothing life-threatening. Rest recommended for at least 48 hours. Physically, she would be fine. It was everything else that felt broken. "You're not nobody. Not to me. Not to anyone who ever really knew you." Hudson's words from the mountainside kept looping in her head, tangled up with the sound of gunfire and Victor's voice saying her name like they were old acquaintances. None of it made sense. She was Linda Hart, 31 years old, executive secretary, a woman whose biggest personality trait, according to her co-workers, was that she remembered everyone's birthday and always had spare pens. She was not the kind of person mercenaries hunted through blizzards. Unless she wasn't only that. The thought had been sitting uncomfortably in her chest since the helicopter ride here, something she couldn't quite name, like a word stuck on the tip of her tongue. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. Hudson leaned in, still in the same dark, snow-damp clothes from the raid, looking like he hadn't slept in days rather than hours. "The doctor wants a word about your blood work," he said. "I'll be 10 minutes. Rest." "Hudson, 10 minutes," he said again, gentler this time, and something in his eyes told her this wasn't the moment for the conversation they both knew was coming. He needed to brace himself for it as much as she did. "I promise. Then we'll talk. About everything." The door clicked shut behind him. Linda sat alone in the too-quiet room, the mug of tea slowly cooling in her hands, and let her eyes wander to the heavy travel jacket he'd shed and tossed over the armchair in the corner, the one he'd worn through the entire raid, still dusted faintly with snow. She wasn't trying to snoop. She told herself that later, over and over, as if it mattered. She simply stood to hang the jacket properly, an old secretarial instinct, the same reflex that made her straighten stacks of paper and align pens on a desk. As she lifted it, something heavy shifted inside the inner pocket and slipped free, hitting the carpet with a soft, deliberate thud. A case. Small, worn at the edges, the leather cracked with age in a way that suggested years of handling, years of being carried close. Silver detailing along the frame, tarnished, but clearly once expensive. She should have left it. She told herself that too later. Instead, her fingers opened it before her mind fully caught up with her hands. Inside was a photograph, the kind with slightly faded color that came from being touched too often, folded and unfolded, carried through years rather than sitting safely in a drawer. It was her, younger, sun-kissed, laughing with her head tipped back on a beach somewhere impossibly blue, wind pulling her hair sideways. And beside her, arms wrapped around her waist, forehead pressed to her temple in a way that spoke of an ease and intimacy, a total absence of the careful distance he kept now, was Hudson. Not Hudson the Mafia boss, not Hudson the composed executive who signed her paychecks and called her Ms. Hart in front of the board. This Hudson was younger, unguarded, smiling with his whole face in a way she had genuinely never once seen in 3 years of working 8 feet from his office door. Linda's hands began to shake. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she somehow recognized despite never having seen it, soft, looping, unmistakably her own, were 4 words. 7 years. Forever, my love. The room tilted. She had no memory of this beach, no memory of this dress, this laugh, this version of herself, who apparently once wrote love notes on the backs of photographs. Her memory, her actual documented memory, began 6 years ago in a hospital bed after a car accident that had left her with severe retrograde amnesia, waking to a life she'd had to relearn from photographs and other people's stories. She'd built herself back up from nothing, a support worker, a new apartment, eventually a job as a secretary at a private investment firm that turned out, she'd learned slowly, uneasily over 3 years, to be considerably more than an investment firm. She had never once questioned why Hudson Cole, a man with a reputation for icy detachment, had personally interviewed her for a secretarial position. Never questioned why he'd been so patient with her, so strangely protective. Why he flew into a war zone the second her voice cracked over a phone line. Because there had been no reason to question it. Until now. 7 years ago. 1 year before her memory began. This photograph wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a stranger's face that happened to resemble hers. It was her, embracing him. Exactly the way a wife embraces the man she loves. The door opened behind her. Linda spun around, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hand, and found Hudson standing frozen in the doorway, his expression collapsing in real time as he saw exactly what she was holding. For 3 years, he had built an entire, careful architecture of distance, of professional titles, of Ms. Hart and Sir, brick by deliberate brick, to protect her from a truth doctors had warned him could shatter her mind completely. She had just found the one crack in the wall he'd never accounted for. "Linda," he said, and his voice broke on her name in a way she had never heard from him before. "I can explain." "Then explain," she whispered, holding the photograph up between them like evidence, like a wound. "Explain to me why I'm standing on a beach in your arms a year before my life apparently started. Explain to me why you look at me like that in this picture, and like this every single day since." Hudson closed the door slowly behind him, and for the first time in 6 long years, let every wall he'd ever built come down at once. He didn't move toward her right away. He stood with his back against the closed door, as if he needed something solid behind him before he could say what came next. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I don't want to sit down. I want an answer." "Linda." Her name again, and this time it cracked all the way through. "Please, if I don't sit down, I don't think I'll be able to say any of this standing up." Something in his voice, raw, stripped of every ounce of the control she'd known him by for 3 years, made her lower herself onto the edge of the bed after all. The photograph stayed clenched in her hand, her thumb pressed hard against the faded image of that laughing, unfamiliar version of herself. Hudson crossed the room slowly and sank into the armchair across from her, elbows on his knees, hands laced together like a man praying for the first time in years. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were wet, and the sight of it frightened her more than Victor's rifle ever had. She had never once seen Hudson Cole cry. She hadn't been entirely sure he was capable of it. "7 years ago," he began, and his voice shook on every word. "You weren't my secretary. You were my wife." The word landed in the room like a struck bell, ringing long after he'd said it. "That's not—" Linda's laugh came out broken, disbelieving. "Hudson, that's not possible. I would know. I would remember something, anything." "You don't remember," he said, "because 6 years ago someone tried to finish me, and they used the car you were driving to do it." The room went very still. "It wasn't an accident," he continued, forcing the words out like they cost him something physical. "A rival organization wanted me gone. They couldn't get to me directly, so they went after the one thing I actually loved. Cut your brake line on a mountain road you drove every week. You went off the ridge doing 60 miles an hour. His hands tightened around each other until the knuckles went white. I got the call 20 minutes later. I have never in my life run faster toward anything, and I have never in my life been more certain I'd already lost." Linda sat frozen, the photograph trembling in her grip, every instinct screaming that this couldn't be real, colliding against a quieter, more terrifying instinct that whispered it explained everything. The strange déjà vu she sometimes felt in his office, the inexplicable comfort of his voice on the phone from her very first day, the dreams she never told anyone about, of a beach she'd never consciously visited. "You survived," Hudson said. "Barely. Weeks in a coma. When you woke up, you didn't know your own name, let alone mine. The doctors called it severe retrograde amnesia, total loss of the years surrounding the trauma. And then," he stopped, swallowed hard. "Then the specialist sat me down and told me something that broke me worse than almost losing you in the first place." "What?" Linda breathed, barely audible. "They told me if I tried to force your memories back, if I walked in as your husband, showed you our home, our life, everything you'd lost all at once, the shock could be catastrophic. Permanent psychological damage, they said. Possibly worse. Your mind had built walls around that trauma to survive it, and tearing them down too fast could break you completely." His voice dropped to almost nothing. I couldn't risk that. I would rather live the rest of my life as a stranger to you than risk losing you twice. So you just... Linda's voice cracked, anger and grief tangling together until she couldn't separate them. You erased yourself? You let me believe I was someone else, that I built this whole life from nothing, and the entire time you were what? Watching from 3 feet away? I hired you back under your maiden name, he admitted. Hart, your name before we married. I told myself it was so I could keep you close, keep you protected, without forcing anything on you that your mind wasn't ready for. I told myself that was the only reason. He looked up at her then, and whatever composure he had left finally gave out entirely. But the truth, Linda, the real truth, is that I was a coward. I was terrified that if I told you who we used to be, you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now. Like I'm a stranger who stole something from you. And I couldn't survive losing you a second time. So I hid. For 6 years, I hid behind a desk and a title, and I let you call me sir, and every single day, it felt like drowning. Linda pressed the photograph to her chest without meaning to, some instinct older than memory pulling it close. Every anniversary, Hudson went on, quieter now, almost to himself. Every year on the date we got married, I flew somewhere alone and didn't tell anyone why. Every time you laughed at something in a meeting, I had to leave the room because you laugh exactly the way you used to laugh on that beach, and I couldn't. He broke off, pressing the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. I couldn't let you see what that did to me. The silence between them stretched long and fragile, filled with 6 years of things unsaid. Why tonight? Linda finally whispered. Why tell me now? Hudson looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was nothing guarded left in his expression at all. Because tonight, I almost lost you again, he said, and I realized I would rather have you hate me for the truth than have you die never knowing you were loved enough to survive twice. Linda looked down at the photograph in her lap, at the woman she apparently used to be, laughing in the arms of a man she was only now, for the first time, truly seeing. She didn't know if she believed him yet, but some small, wordless part of her, older than 3 years, older than the amnesia, older than everything she thought she knew about her own life, was already starting to. They didn't speak much on the flight to Italy. Hudson had suggested it the next morning, hesitant in a way she'd never seen from him. Not an order, not the certainty he carried into every other decision, but something closer to a question. There's a place, somewhere Victor's network has never touched, somewhere that used to be ours before. You don't have to go. But if you want to understand any of this, really understand it, I think you need to see it. She'd said yes before she'd fully decided to. Rosethorn Villa sat on a cliff above the Amalfi coastline, pale stone walls softened by 7 years of salt wind, terraced gardens spilling down toward the water in cascades of lemon trees and bougainvillea. It didn't look like anything Linda associated with Hudson Cole, not the glass and steel boardrooms, not the fortified Aspen chalet, not the cold efficiency of his corporate tower. This place looked lived in, loved. We bought it the year we married, Hudson said as the car wound up the private drive, his voice careful like he was handling something breakable. You picked it. You said you wanted somewhere Victor's world couldn't reach, somewhere that felt like it belonged to us and no one else. Linda said nothing, but something in her chest tightened at the words, "You picked it," at the strange ghost ache of ownership over a life she couldn't remember choosing. Inside, the villa was quiet in a way that felt suspended, preserved. Dust sheets covered some of the furniture, but not all of it, as though someone had kept certain rooms alive out of habit, out of hope. A study with a woman's reading glasses still resting on an open book, a kitchen with two mismatched coffee mugs hung side by side on hooks, hers chipped at the handle. A hallway of photographs Linda hadn't been ready to look at yet, though she felt their presence like a held breath the whole time she walked past.
"You kept everything,"
she said quietly, running her fingers along the back of a sun-faded armchair. "I couldn't make myself change it." Hudson stood a careful distance behind her, hands in his pockets, watching her the way a man watches something fragile he's afraid to startle. "Every time I thought about redecorating, about moving on properly, it felt like admitting you were never coming back. So I just left it. Paid a caretaker to keep the dust off. Told myself I'd deal with it eventually." "Eventually," Linda repeated softly. 6 years is a long eventually." "I know." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and for the first time since Aspen, she let herself see past the Mafia boss, past the wounded stranger from the hospital room, and glimpse something that felt startlingly, achingly familiar. The particular way his jaw tightened when he was trying not to show how much something hurt him. She didn't remember learning that about him, and yet she knew it. The way you know a word in a language you supposedly never learned. That evening, he cooked. It surprised her. She'd assumed a man like Hudson Cole employed people for everything, but he moved around the villa's kitchen with an ease that suggested old, worn habit, pulling ingredients from memory rather than any list. He caught her watching and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile, the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen from him since this entire nightmare began. "You taught me," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "Terribly, at first. I burned an entire kitchen's worth of pasta the first year we were married. You made me practice every Sunday until I stopped being a liability." "Did it work?" "Judge for yourself." They ate on the terrace as the sun dropped into the sea, the sky bruising into deep orange and violet, the only sounds the waves below and the occasional distant church bell drifting up from the village. For the length of that dinner, there was no victor, no bank of syndicate enemies, no 6 years of buried grief sitting between them like a locked door. Just two people, slowly, carefully, remembering how to exist in the same space without flinching. "Can I ask you something?" Linda said eventually, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "Anything." "Do you regret it? Not telling me sooner?" Hudson was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening water rather than at her. "Every single day," he admitted. "But I also think—" He stopped, choosing the words carefully, the way he chose everything. "I think if I'd told you the moment you woke up in that hospital bed, you would have spent 6 years grieving a version of yourself you couldn't access, trying to force your way back into a life that didn't feel like yours yet. Instead, you built something, a whole person from nothing, strong enough to survive Victor's men in a blackout without falling apart, sharp enough to spot things in my business no one else notices." He finally looked at her. "I don't regret protecting that person you became, Linda. I only regret how much it cost both of us to get here." Something in Linda's chest, wound tight since the moment the photograph had slipped from that jacket, finally, quietly, began to loosen. She didn't have her memories back. She might never have them back, not fully. The doctors, when Hudson had finally let her speak with them directly that afternoon, had been honest about that uncertainty. But sitting on this terrace, in this house that had apparently once been hers, watching this man who'd flown through a blizzard for a woman he'd spent 6 years loving in silence, she understood something the amnesia had never taken from her. She didn't need the old memories to know this feeling was real. Later, as the moon rose fully over the water, and Hudson walked her to the room that had once, impossibly, unbelievably, been theirs, Linda paused at the doorway and looked back at him. "Stay," she said quietly. "Not for anything. Just stay. I don't want to be alone with all of this tonight." For the first time in 6 years, Hudson Cole did not have to guard the distance between them. He simply stayed. The peace didn't last past midnight. Linda woke first, some instinct she couldn't name pulling her out of sleep before any actual sound registered. She lay still in the dark for a moment, listening, and then she heard it, the low, distant drone of boat engines, too many of them, cutting across the water toward the villa's private dock. "Hudson!" She was already shaking his shoulder. "Hudson, wake up! Boats!" He was up and moving before she finished the sentence, years of instinct overriding whatever exhaustion the last 2 days had earned him. He crossed to the window, and Linda watched his whole body go rigid at what he saw below. A cluster of dark shapes cutting through the moonlit water, running without lights, closing fast on the villa's small private harbor. "How many?" Linda breathed. 4 boats, maybe 20 men. His jaw tightened. Victor's not being subtle anymore. He's done playing careful. "How did he find us? You said this place was off his network entirely." It was. Hudson was already pulling on clothes, moving to the wall safe hidden behind an old family portrait. Which means someone told him. Someone with access to our flight logs, our transport routes. His face went hard. "I'll deal with that question after we survive this one." He handed her a small pistol from the safe, something she hadn't known he kept there, something that felt strange and heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. And yet her fingers found the grip with an ease that surprised them both. "You know how to use that," he said, half question, half realization dawning across his face. Linda looked down at the weapon in her own hand and felt the same eerie recognition she'd felt in the kitchen, in the hallway of photographs, in a dozen small, unconscious moments since Aspen. "I don't know how I know. I just do." "You trained for years," Hudson said quietly. "Before we married. You weren't always a secretary, Linda. There's more of your old life I haven't told you yet. Later, I promise, later." He was already moving toward the door. "Right now, I need you to trust that instinct." Downstairs, the villa's old security system flickered to life on a hidden panel Hudson activated with a code. Cameras feeding grainy night vision footage of the dock, the gardens, the perimeter walls. Linda's eyes moved across the screens with an unexpected clarity, cataloging details before her conscious mind caught up. "There," she said suddenly, pointing at the third screen. "That panel by the boathouse. That's not decorative, is it?" Hudson looked at her sharply. "You remember that?" "I don't remember it. I just recognize what it is." She was already crossing to it, some old, buried competence guiding her hands to a hidden latch beneath the ornamental stonework. "This is a manual override for the perimeter floodlights. You'd need this if the main system ever got compromised." "You designed half this system," Hudson said, something raw and amazed cutting through the tension in his voice. 7 years ago, you didn't trust anyone else with it." Linda didn't have time to sit with the strangeness of that. Below, the first boat was cutting its engine, sliding silent toward the dock, dark figures already rising to disembark. "On my signal," Hudson said, positioning himself at the terrace doors, rifle raised. "Hit the floodlights, all of them, full power. It'll blind their night vision completely for at least 10 seconds. That's our window." Linda's hands were steady on the override panel in a way that startled her. No tremor, no hesitation, just cold, focused readiness. Like her body remembered a version of danger her mind had never consciously lived through. "Now," Hudson said. She slammed the override. The entire cliffside erupted in blinding white light, every floodlight around the property firing at full intensity at once. Below, Victor's men staggered, weapons flailing, night vision goggles rendered useless, shouts of confusion rising over the crash of waves. Hudson didn't hesitate. He moved through the chaos with brutal, practiced precision, using the 10 seconds of blindness to take down 3 men before they'd even registered where the shots were coming from. Linda stayed at the panel, cycling the floods in patterned bursts exactly as though she'd done it 100 times before, disorienting wave after wave of Victor's men as they tried to regroup on the dock below. It wasn't until the fighting moved further from the house, until she saw Hudson disarm a 4th attacker with a move that looked less like violence and more like art, that she let herself process what was happening. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't frozen. Some deep, wordless part of her had simply known what to do, and that certainty terrified her almost more than the gunfire itself. The attack broke within minutes, Victor's remaining men retreating to their boats under a hail of gunfire from Hudson's private security team, who'd finally roused and joined the fight from the villa's lower level. By the time the last engine faded into the darkness, the dock below was littered with wreckage, and Hudson stood at the water's edge, chest heaving, blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own. Linda came down to find him staring out at the empty water, his expression unreadable. "He's not going to stop," Hudson said quietly, without turning around. "Not until he's burned everything I have to the ground. My business, my people." His hand found hers without either of them quite deciding it. "You." "Then we stop him first," Linda said. Hudson turned to look at her, and something in his expression, grief and love and a terrible, dawning respect, settled into something harder, more resolved. "Someone gave him our location," he said. "Someone close to us. I need to find that mole before he strikes again, and I need to do it fast." Linda thought of the flight logs, the transport schedules, the paperwork that had crossed her desk 100 times without her ever really looking at it. "I think," she said slowly, "I might already know where to start looking." They left the villa before sunrise, in an armored transport Hudson kept garaged beneath the property for exactly this kind of departure. Reinforced panels, blacked-out windows, a route mapped to avoid every camera and checkpoint between the coast and Milan. Linda sat in the back, with a laptop balanced on her knees, the same one she used every day at the office to manage Hudson's calendar and correspondence, except now it was pulled up to something she'd never had reason to look at before. Internal transport and dispatch records, the quiet administrative bloodstream of an organization she was only just beginning to understand she'd once helped build. "You said Victor's men tracked our radar signature," she said, scrolling through pages of fuel logs. "But radar doesn't explain how he knew to be waiting at the villa specifically. Someone had to know our flight plan before we even left Geneva." "That's what I need you to find," Hudson said from the seat across from her, watching the passing hills with the tense stillness of a man expecting another ambush at any moment. "I trust maybe 4 people with our transport schedules. I need to know which one sold us out." Linda's eyes moved down the columns of numbers with a focus that felt, once again, unnervingly natural. She wasn't consciously trying to remember anything. She'd stopped expecting flashes of the old life to arrive like lightning bolts. But her hands moved with a competence that clearly predated the last 3 years, flagging inconsistencies, cross-referencing timestamps, the way a person moves through a room they've walked through 1,000 times in the dark. "Here." She turned the screen toward him. "Geneva refueling request, filed 2 hours before we landed, authorized by your chief logistics manager, Grant Whitfield." "Grant's been with me 12 years, Hudson said, frowning. "Before you and I even met." "That's exactly why it works." Linda scrolled further, pulling up a second document. "Look at the destination code on this dispatch order. It's routed through a private fueling contractor in Geneva that isn't on your approved vendor list. I checked. I remember approving that list myself back when I first started working for you. This contractor was never on it." Hudson leaned forward, studying the screen, his expression darkening with every second. "That's not a mistake. Someone added an unauthorized vendor to route information through an outside channel." "A channel Victor's people could tap," Linda finished. Grant didn't have to hand Victor anything directly. He just had to reroute one small piece of paperwork through the wrong contractor and let Victor's intelligence people do the rest. Hudson sat back, jaw tight, betrayal settling into his face in a way that looked almost physically painful. 12 years, he said again, quieter this time. I made that man's career. I trusted him with things I didn't even trust myself with. Money, Linda said gently. Or fear. Victor doesn't strike me as a man who asks nicely. Both, probably. Hudson exhaled slowly, forcing the emotion back down into something usable. Can you tell how far this goes? Is Grant still actively feeding him information, or was Aspen and the villa the extent of it? Linda was already pulling up another set of records, cross-checking timestamps against Grant's known movements over the past week. There's a pattern, she said slowly. Small data requests every few days, routed the same way. He's still active. Which means we can use that, Hudson finished, something sharp and calculating replacing the hurt in his eyes. If Grant's still feeding Victor information, we control what information he gets. Linda looked up at him, understanding dawning fast. You want to feed him false coordinates. I want Victor chasing shadows while we finish what we actually came to Milan to do. Hudson leaned forward, some of his old, commanding certainty returning to his posture. Can you do that? Route a false GPS signal through the same channel Grant's been using? Make it look legitimate? Linda's fingers were already moving across the keyboard, pulling up the transport system's back end with the same eerie fluency she'd shown at the villa's security panel. I helped design half this dispatch system, she murmured, almost to herself, some fragment of old memory surfacing not as a picture, but as pure, wordless competence. I know exactly how to make a false entry look real. Over the next 20 minutes, working with a focus that silenced even Hudson's simmering anger at Grant's betrayal, Linda built a convincing false trail, a fabricated transport request routing Hudson Cole's position toward an abandoned airstrip 40 miles outside Milan, time-stamped and authorized through the same compromised contractor channel Grant had been using all along. If Grant checks the system in the next hour, she said, sitting back, he'll see exactly what Victor wants to see. Us, heading toward that airstrip instead of the city. And Victor will move his people to intercept a target that isn't there. Hudson looked at her with something that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably since Aspen. Not just love, not just grief, but genuine respect. The look of a man realizing his partner was not someone he needed to protect from every threat, but someone who could stand directly beside him and meet those threats head-on. You just bought us hours we didn't have. What happens to Grant? Linda asked quietly. Hudson's expression hardened. That's a conversation for after Milan. The transport rolled on through the gray morning light, the city skyline beginning to rise on the horizon ahead of them, and Linda found herself studying her own reflection in the window glass. A woman who, 3 days ago, believed her entire identity began in a hospital bed 6 years ago. Now sitting in an armored vehicle, rerouting false intelligence to outmaneuver mercenaries, doing it with a fluency that felt less like relearning and more like remembering. Whoever she used to be, Linda thought, watching Milan's skyline sharpen into focus, that woman hadn't disappeared when the amnesia took her memories. She'd just been waiting, quietly, for a reason to come back. The bank sat on a quiet street in Milan's financial district, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building that didn't need to announce its importance, because everyone who mattered already knew what it was. Private wealth management for clients who valued discretion above all else. Victor kept his war chest here. Hudson had confirmed it weeks earlier through channels he didn't explain and Linda didn't ask about. He's been building towards something bigger than a personal vendetta, Hudson said as their car idled across the street, both of them dressed now in the kind of understated, expensive clothing that belonged in this part of the city. Mercenaries, weapons, the men he's lost in Aspen and at the villa. None of that is cheap. If I can cut off the money feeding all of it, I cripple him faster than any gunfight ever could." "And you think I can get us in?" Linda said. "I know you can." Hudson pulled a small folder from his jacket and handed it to her. Inside was a set of credentials, an administrative access badge, complete with a photograph of her from years ago, a name she didn't recognize printed beneath it. "You helped design the security protocols for this branch. Client verification systems, access tiers, all of it. Victor doesn't know that. He inherited an account structure built by a woman he thinks no longer exists." Linda stared at the photograph on the badge. Herself, younger, her hair different, wearing an expression of quiet, competent authority she didn't recognize on her own face, and yet somehow understood completely. "How many other pieces of my old life are you going to keep handing me, one folder at a time?" "As many as it takes," Hudson said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't give them to you sooner. I was trying to protect you. I think I understand now that protecting you and controlling what you know were never quite the same thing." She didn't have an answer for that yet, not one she trusted herself to say out loud in the middle of a job like this. She tucked the badge into a jacket instead and nodded once. "Tell me the plan." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which Linda suspected was the point. She would enter through the main floor using her old administrative credentials, still technically valid in a system that had never flagged her for removal, because whoever maintained the account structure after her disappearance had apparently never thought to check whether a presumed dead architect might one day walk back through the front door. Hudson would remain outside, monitoring security channels, ready to intervene only if something went wrong. "I don't like this part," he admitted, watching her check the badge one final time. "You alone, inside a building full of people who work for men who want you finished."
"You said it yourself. Victor doesn't know I'm alive in any meaningful sense. As far as his intelligence is concerned, I'm your secretary, not a threat."
Linda met his eyes, steady despite the tremor she could feel in her own chest.
"Let me do this, Hudson. Let me be useful for something bigger than filing paperwork."
He didn't argue further, though the tension in his jaw didn't ease either. Inside, the bank moved with the hushed, controlled rhythm of institutions built for the very wealthy. Soft carpet, softer voices, an atmosphere designed to make large sums of money feel unremarkable. Linda presented her credentials to a floor manager who barely glanced up before waving her through to the private terminals, some old muscle memory guiding her posture, her tone, the exact clipped efficiency of someone who belonged there. The account structure, when she finally accessed it from a private terminal, was more familiar than she expected, not because she remembered building it, but because good design, she realized, had a kind of internal logic that transcended memory. She'd built it to be intuitive even to a stranger. She simply hadn't expected to one day be the stranger, relying on her own past competence to navigate it. Victor's escrow accounts sat nested 3 layers deep, disguised behind shell entities and offshore holding companies, exactly the kind of structure designed to survive a casual audit. But Linda wasn't conducting a casual audit. She was moving through the system the way its original architect would, finding the seams she herself had built in, testing access points she somehow simply knew would be there. Her hands moved fast across the terminal, transferring funds through a chain of accounts that would take investigators months to fully untangle, funneling the entirety of Victor's mercenary war chest into a dead trust Hudson had set up specifically for this purpose, untouchable, unreachable, effectively erased from any account Victor could access again. A floor manager passed behind her twice during the transfer, and both times Linda felt her pulse spike, certain she was about to be stopped, questioned, exposed. Both times, the manager simply nodded politely and moved on, seeing nothing but a woman with proper credentials doing routine administrative work.
the transfer completed with a soft confirmation chime that felt, in that quiet room, deafeningly loud. Done.
She logged out, returned the terminal to its idle screen, and walked back through the lobby with the same measured, unhurried pace she'd entered with, every instinct screaming at her to run, and every trained reflex insisting she do exactly the opposite. Hudson was waiting exactly where she'd left him, his relief visible the moment she slid into the car beside him.
It's done,
She said. Every account, emptied and moved somewhere he'll never trace. Hudson exhaled like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for years. Do you understand what you just did? You didn't just hurt him financially. You just took away his ability to fund another attack. Against me, against you, against anyone. I understand, Linda said, and for the first time since Aspen, she let herself feel something close to triumph instead of fear. I think I finally understand what kind of woman I used to be, Hudson. And I think I like her. Hudson reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together with a certainty that needed no further explanation. So do I, he said quietly. I always have. The safe house suite Hudson kept in Milan occupied the top floor of a building with no name on the directory, accessible only by a private elevator that required 2 separate codes to activate. After the tension of the bank, after days that had stretched Linda's nerves thinner than she'd known they could go, the quiet of the suite felt almost unbearably loud. She showered first, standing under water too hot for comfort, trying to wash away the adrenaline still humming under her skin. When she came out, wrapped in one of the plush robes hanging in the closet, a robe, she noted distantly, that fit her exactly, as though it had been chosen for her specifically rather than a random guest, she found Hudson on the balcony, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring out at the lit sprawl of the city below.
You should be celebrating,
she said, joining him at the railing.
We won today.
We survived today, he corrected quietly. There's a difference. Victor's broke now, but broke men are more dangerous, not less. He'll come at us with whatever he has left, and he won't be careful about it. He glanced at her, something softening in his expression, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. But you're right. We should take the win where we can find it. She leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her without hesitation, the two of them standing in silence for a long moment, watching the city breathe below them. It struck Linda, standing there, how naturally her body had learned to fit against his in just a few short days. Or perhaps, she thought, it wasn't learning at all. Perhaps it was simply remembering. That thought had been circling her for the better part of the day, growing louder with every hour, until she couldn't hold it in any longer.
Hudson,
she said, turning to face him fully.
I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything.
Something flickered across his face. Wariness, maybe. Or the particular fear of a man who had spent 6 years afraid of exactly this kind of sentence. Okay. Linda took a breath, steadying herself against whatever came next. I got my memories back. The whiskey glass slipped slightly in his hand before he caught it. What? Not in Aspen, not when I found the photograph. She held up a hand before he could speak further. 6 months ago, Hudson, before any of this started, before Victor, before the airlock, before Geneva, before any of it. Hudson stared at her, and she watched the entire foundation of the last several days shift beneath him in real time. Every conversation, every careful revelation he'd agonized over sharing, every moment he'd believed himself the one holding the truth, suddenly inverted. 6 months, he repeated slowly. You've known who you were for 6 months. Yes. You've known you were my wife, that we were married, that everything I told you in Geneva. His voice caught, disbelief and something sharper, more wounded, cutting through it. You already knew all of it. Yes, Linda said again, quieter this time, watching him carefully.
I need you to understand why.
He set the whiskey glass down on the railing with deliberate, controlled precision, the kind of movement she now recognized as the effort of a man trying very hard not to let his hands shake. Then explain it to me. Because right now it feels like you let me relive the worst 6 years of my life in that hospital room, watching me fall apart, when you already had the answer.
It wasn't like that.
Linda reached for his hand, and though he didn't pull away, he didn't fully accept it either. His fingers stayed loose, uncertain, waiting. The memories came back slowly, over weeks. Fragments at first, a smell, a feeling, half a sentence I didn't understand. By the time I had enough of them to know who I really was, I also knew something else. She swallowed hard. I knew who you'd become, watching me. Careful, distant. A man performing the role of my boss so perfectly that I almost couldn't see the husband underneath it anymore. Linda, let me finish. Her grip on his hand tightened. I could have walked into your office that day and told you everything. And some part of me wanted to, so badly. But I kept thinking about what would happen next. You'd see your wife again, the woman from before the accident, the marriage you lost, the 7 years you were trying so hard to get back. And I was terrified, Hudson, that you'd fall back in love with her, with the ghost, not with who I'd actually become in the 6 years since. Hudson's jaw worked, emotion warring visibly across his face. You thought I wouldn't love who you are now? I didn't know, Linda admitted, her voice breaking for the first time. I didn't know if the man who married me 7 years ago could love the woman who came out the other side of losing everything and rebuilding herself from nothing. So I waited. I watched you fall for me all over again. Not the memory of me, but the actual present-day me, filing your paperwork and remembering your coffee order and slowly becoming someone you couldn't stop looking at across a boardroom table. I needed to know that was real before I told you the truth. The city lights blurred slightly through the sudden wetness in Hudson's eyes. 6 months, he said again, but softer now, the anger draining out of the words replaced by something raw and disbelieving. You watched me grieve a version of you that was standing right in front of me the entire time? I know, Linda whispered. I'm sorry. I know it was selfish, but I needed to be sure, Hudson. I needed to know you loved me. Not the ghost in that photograph. Not the wife you lost. Me. Now. Hudson closed the distance between them in a single step, pulling her against him with a desperation that answered every fear she'd carried for 6 silent months, his hands framing her face like he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. I have loved you across every version you've ever been, he said fiercely, his forehead pressed to hers, his voice thick with 6 years of grief, finally breaking loose into something like joy. The woman on that beach, the stranger who walked into my office needing a job, the woman who just emptied a war chest with nothing but a laptop and nerve, all of it, all of you. There was never a version I loved more than another, Linda. There was only ever you. She kissed him then, and it felt less like a beginning than a long, hard-won return. 2 people who had spent 6 years circling the same truth from opposite directions, finally standing in the same place at last. Outside, Milan glittered on, indifferent to the war still waiting for them. But for tonight, husband and wife held each other, and let that be enough. Victor surfaced 3 days later, exactly the way Hudson had predicted, desperate, broke, and reckless enough to come home. The message arrived through an old, half-forgotten channel Hudson hadn't used in years, a courier delivering a single line of text with no signature needed. The Cathedral, sunrise, come alone or I start burning what's left of your syndicate to the ground out of spite." "He knows he's beaten," Hudson said, reading it over Linda's shoulder in the dim light of their Milan suite. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a man trying to go down, taking something with him."
"Then we don't let him."
Linda's voice was steady, none of the fear from Aspen left in it. Something had settled into her over the last week. Not just memory, but purpose.
"You're not going alone." "Linda, I emptied his war chest with my own hands. I am not sitting in a hotel room while you finish this without me."
She met his eyes, and whatever protective instinct rose in him died quietly under the weight of her certainty.
"We finish this together, the way we started."
The grand city cathedral had stood at the center of Hudson's home territory for 200 years, its towering nave and hidden passages as familiar to Linda, she discovered, as her own hands. Another fragment of the life she'd once helped build alongside him, back when protecting this territory had meant knowing every stone of it by heart. They arrived before dawn, the cathedral empty and cavernous, morning light just beginning to filter gray and pale through the stained glass high above. Victor was already waiting near the altar, flanked by only 2 men, a fraction of the force he'd commanded in Aspen, proof of exactly how much damage Linda's bank transfer had done. "Cole!" Victor called out, his voice echoing strangely off stone and marble. "I see you brought your ghost." "She has a name," Hudson said, stopping a careful distance away, Linda a half-step behind his shoulder. "And you're the one who's finished, Victor. Not her. Not me." Victor's laugh was thin, brittle at the edges, a man performing confidence he no longer fully possessed. "Finished. Funny word coming from a man about to lose everything he actually cares about." He gestured, and from behind a pillar, one of his men shoved a third figure forward into the light. Linda's breath caught. Grant Whitfield, hands bound, a bruise darkening one side of his face, stumbled to his knees near the altar steps. "Your logistics manager proved surprisingly useful," Victor said, "right up until his usefulness ran out. I thought I'd let you have him back before I finish you both. Call it professional courtesy." "You don't get to use him as leverage," Hudson said, his voice dropping into something cold and final. "Not after what he cost me. Not after everything he handed you." "Then let's not waste time on sentiment." Victor's hand moved toward the weapon at his side. "You took my money, my men, my leverage. I have exactly one thing left to spend, Cole, and that's this cathedral turning into your grave." The first shot came fast, faster than negotiation ever intended to allow, Victor firing not at Hudson directly, but toward the pillar Linda stood near, a warning meant to scatter them both. Hudson returned fire immediately, driving Victor and his remaining men back toward the altar, the exchange echoing violently off marble and stained glass. Linda didn't freeze. She'd stopped freezing days ago. Instead, she moved low and fast along the side aisle, following a memory that surfaced not as image, but as instinct. A service corridor behind the choir stalls, a mechanism she somehow knew existed, though she'd never consciously recalled learning it. Her hands found the old iron lever hidden behind a carved wooden panel, exactly where her body seemed to know it would be. "Hudson!" she shouted over the gunfire. "Get him toward the choir gates!" Hudson didn't question her. Years of trust, old and new both, carried the instruction forward without hesitation. He drove Victor backward through controlled bursts of fire, forcing the desperate man to retreat exactly where Linda needed him, directly beneath the heavy iron choir gates suspended above the transept, relics of the cathedral's original design, built centuries ago to seal the choir from the nave during ceremonies. Victor, chasing what he thought was a cornered target, never looked up. "Now!" Hudson shouted. Linda threw her full weight against the lever. The iron gates crashed down with a deafening, ancient groan, sealing Victor and his last remaining man into the open transept, cutting them off from cover, from escape, from anywhere to hide. Victor spun, realizing too late what had happened, firing wildly at the bars separating him from freedom. Hudson didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in seconds, disarming Victor's remaining guard with brutal efficiency before turning the full weight of 6 years of grief and rage on the man who'd started it all. Victor raised his weapon one final time, desperate, cornered, out of options. Hudson was faster. The gunshot echoed once through the cathedral, and then silence fell, total and absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the distant, indifferent chime of a bell somewhere in the tower above, marking an hour that had nothing to do with any of them. Victor's body slumped against the very gates that had sealed his fate, and the war that had chased them across 3 countries, finally, completely, ended. Linda released the lever and crossed the nave on unsteady legs, Hudson meeting her halfway, pulling her into an embrace that held 6 years of fear and 5 days of impossible danger all at once. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "Linda, it's actually over." Behind them, Grant Whitfield knelt on the cathedral floor, bound and broken, waiting for whatever judgment Hudson's world demanded of traitors. That was a conversation for later. A piece of business Hudson would handle with the same cold precision he handled everything within his organization. For now, standing in the pale morning light flooding through stained glass, surrounded by the wreckage of a war finally won, Linda simply let herself be held. Whatever came next, they would face it as exactly what they'd always been. Memory or no memory. Secret or no secret. Husband and wife. 2 weeks after the cathedral, the Parker Syndicate's corporate tower buzzed with an energy Linda hadn't felt in the building since she'd started working there. Not the tense, careful energy of people managing a dangerous man's temper, but something lighter, something that felt almost like relief. Word had spread quickly, the way it always did in Hudson's world, that Victor was gone, and the threat that had shadowed the organization for years had finally been extinguished. Grant Whitfield's betrayal had been dealt with quietly, thoroughly, in a manner Hudson didn't discuss with her and Linda didn't ask about. Some corners of this world, she'd learned, still belonged to him alone, and she'd made peace with that boundary the same way she'd made peace with the rest of the life she was still, slowly, fully reclaiming. She sat at her desk that morning exactly the way she had for 3 years, sorting through Hudson's calendar, answering emails, keeping the machinery of his empire running smoothly from the outside in. Except everything felt different now. The careful distance she'd once maintained without understanding why had dissolved entirely. She caught herself smiling at nothing, at memories that were finally, fully her own again. Not fragments surfacing like ghosts, but a whole integrated life, the woman from before the accident and the woman who'd rebuilt herself after it finally settled into a single, complete person. Hudson had called an all-hands meeting for 10 o'clock, which wasn't unusual in itself, except he'd been unusually cagey about the agenda, dodging her questions with a small, private smile that told her he was planning something and enjoying the secret entirely too much. At exactly 10, the doors to the main floor opened, and Hudson walked out of his office. Not toward the boardroom where these meetings typically happened, but straight across the open floor, past dozens of employees who immediately fell silent and turned to watch. Straight toward her desk. "Hudson," she said, half standing. "What's—" "Stay seated for 1 more second," he said, and something in his voice, warm and steady, and entirely unguarded in front of an audience of nearly 100 employees, made her chest tighten with a nervous, hopeful anticipation. "I have an announcement, and I wanted to make it right here, where it belongs." The floor had gone completely quiet. Marcus, standing near the elevator bank, wore the expression of a man who'd clearly been let in on the secret and was struggling not to grin. For 3 years, Hudson said, addressing the room but never taking his eyes off Linda. Most of you have known this woman as Ms. Hart, my secretary. Extraordinarily good at her job, better than she ever let any of you fully see. A small, private smile crossed his face. What most of you don't know is that 7 years ago, before some of you even joined this organization, she was already the most important person in my life. My wife. A woman I lost to an accident that nearly destroyed both of us and spent 6 years quietly, desperately hoping I might someday find my way back to. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. Linda felt her face flush, tears already gathering, though she made no move to stop them.
She came back to me, Hudson continued, his voice thick with an emotion he'd spent years learning to hide from every one of these people. Not because I forced her memory back. Not because I demanded she remember who we used to be. But because she chose, on her own, to become someone strong enough to survive everything Victor's men threw at us. Brave enough to walk back into danger to save this organization, and generous enough to give me a second chance at loving her, even after everything I failed to tell her. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, worn slightly at the corners, clearly the same ring he'd once slipped onto her finger 7 years earlier, and kept safe through every year of silence since. I'm not asking you to marry me, Linda. We're already married. I'm asking you to let me stop hiding it. I'm asking you to let this be who we actually are, in front of everyone, starting today. Linda's hands trembled as he opened the box, the ring inside catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Yes," she said, laughing through the tears now, unable to hold back the fullness of everything crowding her chest at once. Grief for the years lost, gratitude for the ones ahead, and a settled, certain joy she genuinely never expected to feel again. "Hudson, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't quite steady either, and the room around them erupted into applause. Employees who'd spent years wondering about the careful, complicated dynamic between their boss and his secretary, finally understanding exactly what they'd been witnessing all along. "There's one more thing," Hudson said, turning to address the room once the applause settled, keeping Linda's hand held firmly in his own. "Effective today, Linda isn't just returning to the position she once held here. She's stepping in as co-owner of this organization, full partner in every decision this company makes going forward. She's earned that, several times over, in ways most of you will never fully know. Treat her with exactly the respect that title deserves." Linda looked out at the sea of faces watching her, some stunned, some clearly delighted, Marcus openly wiping his eyes near the elevators, and felt something settle into place that had been missing since long before she'd ever woken up in that hospital bed 6 years ago. Not just a marriage restored, not just a name reclaimed, but a wholeness she'd spent years quietly, desperately searching for without ever fully understanding what she was looking for. She wasn't the ghost from a 7-year-old photograph anymore. She wasn't only the woman who'd rebuilt herself from nothing after the accident either. She was both of those women at once, fully integrated, standing beside the man who had loved every version of her, fiercely enough to wait 6 years for the truth to finally set them both free. Outside the windows, the city moved on below them, indifferent and ordinary, utterly unaware that somewhere above it, a war 6 years in the making had finally, completely, ended in exactly the way it always should have. Not in shadows, in the light, together, for everyone to see.